Filipino Young Professional Secretary and Democrat Gabriel Young. Gabe, magandang hapon and thank you for joining us. Welcome back to
Welcome
Storycon.
back, Gabe.
Hi, Gabe.
Hello, maganda hapon. Thank you
yeah.
so much for having me. Unlike our other guests, it's currently 1 in the morning or at 12:30. So just
Oh,
letting you on
dear.
Oh, you're in
you
Berkeley,
just to be sure
California.
that I
Yeah.
can share my perspective with you all. So
How,
thank you for
how, are,
having
how
me.
are things back there, Gabe, since last time we talked?
Things are very tense, very stressful. There's a lot of tension through the air right now. And if you remember from last time, I mentioned that I'm currently doing my master's degree in public policy here at the University of California, Berkeley. And emails are going out to both us grad students and just the general population to check in on each other, make sure your mental health is okay. Remember that our health comes first, and even professors are reaching out to students asking if they want to cancel classes because of how stressful this election is coming down upon us. A lot of the messaging going out right now is this might be one of, if not the most important election in our lifetimes, and so there's a lot of stress and pain going around right now.
Any fearless forecast, Dave?
My fearless forecast, I am, in quotes, naively hopeful that Kamala Harris will pull through, but
Bakit
after
naively?
waking up and checking my polls again, I'm still seeing that the polls are tied 48-48 with that 4% margin of error, but there are lots of polls showing Kamala at 49-48. And so I'm really hoping on that +1 differential. It will really come through on election day, especially as people make their ways to the polls.
But Gabe, there are a lot of concerns. There's a lot of talk about the possibility of some candidates not accepting the results if the result turns out to be against them.
One candidate.
Of course, without naming names. Without naming names. How big is how real is that concern as far as you guys are concerned? I mean, is it really a major concern, or is it just something floating around on top of your head?
It's a major concern, and I don't think it's just floating around my head, but especially folks who are organizing with the Democratic Party and my colleagues over at Filipino-Americans here for Harris Waltz. We're already sensing it, where lots of folks are already hearing that Trump is calling for election fraud. Just recently, earlier today, in his rally over in Michigan, he was already insulting President Joe Biden again. He was insulting Vice President Harris, Nancy Pelosi, and really making the statement that the Democrats will steal this election once again. And so I just recently also read, as I woke up, was that there are a lot of Republican states that are, and their own judges that are trying to block the federal government's Department of Justice for sending down lawyers down into these states to make sure that elections are properly handled. And this has been a historic thing, so it's not as if the Department of Justice is just doing it as a response to Trump, but they're doing it as normal procedure, yet they're already being challenged. And so what a lot of political scientists, my own professors, former secretaries within the administrations are noticing or bracing for is that we probably won't know the election results until Wednesday, Thursday, U.S. time. And then also, we are awaiting a slew of lawsuits going to go up against election officials, Secretary of States, and then even the federal government itself by the Trump campaign, as well as what we saw in 2020. So a lot of us are gearing up for those legal battles. We know that the Harris campaign is staffing itself with lawyers right now just in case, but there is that tension and fear that Donald Trump will not accept the results regardless of what will happen.
Yeah, Gabe, you're talking about tension. The police in DC is on alert. They're watching out for gatherings. But are you implying that there might be violence even outside Washington, outside the Capitol, in California, for example, in other states?
I don't believe in California per se, just because of how Democrat it is, but definitely in swing states and in southern states as well. And so one example that I can give is when we look back in 2020 at Georgia, Georgia had a lot of violence break out, or even violence against each other in communities, and even over in Michigan as well, where folks were fighting against each other to really try to make sure that their votes are counted. And so I will also preface that I don't necessarily mean just physical violence, but also emotional violence. Lots of families breaking apart, and we're expecting to see that too. One thing that I recently realized is that even in amongst my own family, one of my uncles was the chair of Filipino-Americans for Trump Pence back in 2020, and so it's made it very difficult for even my family to really stay connected during this time. And so we're expecting, again, it might not be that physical violence that we saw with January 6th, but definitely during this election day, we're expecting a lot of families to be very torn about where the election will be and going. I will also preface that January 6th, while everyone was anticipating for that to be violent, it really set the tone of future elections, let alone no one has ever heard of Washington, D.C. being boarded up. Even me living there previously, it is such a stark difference of the DC that I can walk around in and feel happy in, but now it seems very dystopian in a sense, where there's gates around the White House, gates around downtown, and former restaurants or even bars that I frequented when I was a student, that they're all boarded up as well. And so this wouldn't have happened, this fear and I'd say preventative measures wouldn't have happened if Trump and his supporters did not do what they did in January 6th. And so the fear is very much real, and the anticipation for violence is also just as much as
Gabe,
real.
do you agree with the political pundits there that who wins Pennsylvania will win the election?
Yes, I definitely do. Breaking it down by the Electoral College of votes, Pennsylvania itself holds a majority of it. I can't get the number off the top of my head, but
it's,
what I was
16.
witnessing was different scenarios. So what could happen is that Harris wins the Rust Belt. So the Rust Belt is defined as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so if Harris wins that, then overwhelming majority, or she can either win the Sun Belt, which is Arizona, Nevada, and then hoping for Georgia as well. However, because of the greater population in Pennsylvania, even if Harris doesn't win, let's say, Wisconsin or Michigan, or she doesn't win Arizona or Georgia or Nevada, the Electoral College votes that are in Pennsylvania really would show the difference and put Vice President Harris much ahead than President Trump.
What happened with the Rust Belt? Because it used to be a blue wall. So what has happened these past few years?
So what's happened in the last few years, going back onto 2020 and then eventually 2016, is that rise of economic populism that we saw. A lot of folks in the industrial sectors in the Rust Belt, and for viewers, I know I'm using the Rust Belt as a throwaway term. The background behind the Rust Belt is that Wisconsin, Michigan, and the area around the Great Lakes was renowned for being an industrial hub. If you think about the history of Chicago, for example, Chicago used to be a heavy steel industry, for example, or packing industry. And so a lot of these manufacturing jobs were the crux of blue-collared America for lower middle-class white Americans. And with the upcoming innovations that have came with technology and eventually combating rising inflation just throughout the past decade, a lot of these folks have been disenfranchised by the policy set forth by the government, blue and red. I'm not saying that it's exclusively Democrat or Republican, but these problems have started economically disenfranchising. And so going even to 2020, one particular candidate, Andrew Yang, campaigned on that and said that artificial intelligence becoming the future will take away manufacturing jobs away from these workers. And regardless of your skin color and your race, a lot of people will be impacted. And so that's exactly what we're seeing, is that a lot of these former industrial workers who are losing their jobs, especially post-COVID-19 pandemic, are really blaming it on Democrats and the government. And so with Trump coming into play, Trump presents himself once again as that figure, that messiah figure, if you will, that will get people their jobs back, really fight for their opportunities, and really make sure that the lower class white American can feel represented. However, the flip side of that as well, of what we're seeing in the Rust Belt, is the rise of the racial ethnic vote, particularly amongst Black Americans and Latino Americans. So if we look at Detroit, for example, Detroit's industry is heavily automobiles, where you think of Ford or you think of Chrysler. And a lot of those people who now work in those factories are actually people of color, racial ethnic Americans. And so they themselves are recognizing that the same divisive language. And while they themselves are being disenfranchised by economic policies, they're finding a lot more solace within Kamala Harris and her campaign, especially if we look at the agriculture industry with Governor Walz reaching out to farmers, than they are seeing with Trump's divisive rhetoric. And so to tie it all in a pretty knot about what is going on in the Rust Belt is that white, disenfranchised, lower class Americans are starting to teeter towards Trump because they're really buying in to the Trump-Vance hillbilly elegy rhetoric, if you will, that they will resurrect the economy and provide that place that they once lost, whereas Kamala Harris is attracting the people of color and racial ethnic minorities to feel empowered that they will be protected under her administration, regardless of immigration status as well.
Do you agree, Gabe, that the Biden statement on garbage will affect the chances of Kamala?
Absolutely. And despite me being a Democrat and despite my previous career in the Biden-Harris administration, I recognize that that comment was not the best, and he definitely could have done better in doing that. And while he has done his best to go back and try to renege that comment and saying that I actually meant that support for Donald Trump is garbage and whatnot, it has hurt the campaign. And there has been murmurs as well as, did President Biden do more damage than good? However, on the flip side of that, while President Biden did say that, it's important to also recognize why President Biden said that. And so we go back to Trump's closing argument speech at Madison Square Garden, where there was a lot of racist, hate-fueled rhetoric that was reminiscent of the 1939 neo-Nazi rally that was held in that same building in Madison Square Garden. We had a comedian called Puerto Rico Garbage. We had him joke about carving watermelons with Black Americans. And then right after that, we had Tucker Carlson and other conservative figures remark about, pardon my French and the cursing, but how these politicians are expletives. And so it really goes to show that while President Biden was speaking from a very emotional state, it was also founded in a very hurt state that his own colleagues and the people who are just doing their best to represent and serve the country are being targeted in and being attacked for their personal character rather than the policies that they champion, and especially the people that he tries to represent, and kind of responding to that floating island of garbage that was mentioned about Puerto Rico in the Madison Square Garden, trying to make that analogy that if you're calling this island a pile of garbage, then it is the same as your support for this person being a pile of garbage. And so, again, I am not defending President Biden's statement. I 100% think he could have said that better, and he did it wrong, and as much as he can try to go back. But I also think it's just as important to see everything in the context of which it came before.
Gabe, from reports that we've been getting, Trump seems to be getting a significant support from a segment of the Filipino-American population. And we've been told that there seems to be a generational gap in this voter preference among Filipino-Americans. Is that correct, that the older generations tend to be more for Trump and the younger ones, like you, are more for Kamala?
Absolutely, there is a huge generational gap. And so I remember when I came on Storycon last time, I mentioned about the surveys that were being hosted by AAPI Data, that acronym standing for Asian American Pacific Islander Data, and APIA Vote, Asian Pacific Islander American Vote. And what they found is that there is a strong correlation that the older you are, the more conservative you tend to be. And then additionally to that, the younger you are, the more liberal you tend to be. And so that is definitely being reflected out in the polls and in the conversation around identity. One of the nonprofits I work for, Lead Filipino, we released a study that really dictated how one's own identity impacts that. And so we find with older Phil-Ams that they tend to still classify themselves either as Filipino or as American, and really hold on to that patriotism and the American dream that the Republican Party really sells. And as I mentioned, my own uncle back in 2020 was the chair of Trump Vance, so it has made Thanksgiving conversations really awkward for my family. But where it differs is that on the younger side, on the side of the table that is alongside with me, who really worked for Biden Harris back in 2020 and now with Harris Waltz here in 2024, is that us youth tend to define ourselves by the Filipino-American identity, where we recognize that sometimes when we go back to the Philippines, we are not Filipino enough. But then here in America, we are not white and American enough. And so that's why we have to accept that Filipino-American identity. And with the separation between the youth and the elder generation is where we find the conservative and liberal camps, that our youth's experiences are really being shaped by that understanding of that Filipino-American identity, and where that came from with the Third World Liberation Movement, advocating against anti-US imperialism and war, whereas the older generations are still holding on to that American dream, especially that a lot of older generations who tended to immigrate when they were much later still hold on to that Christian Catholic faith that is very still dominant in the Philippines. And so lots of folks still tend to be single issue voters with a pro-life, pro-choice perspective or anti-gay marriage, and therefore start aligning more with the conservative Republican Party. Whereas again, my generation, Gen Z, with the youth, we tend to be more open and inclusive because we have seen a lot more of that diversity and impacts and how it influences people's social determinants of health, if you will, here. So again, absolutely correct in your assessment that older generations are going for President Trump, but there's also just as much a majority of youth and younger generations who are going for President Harris. And so in our classes, what we're talking about is that Vice President Harris has a bigger tent, if you will, that she is making sure that there are more people getting out the vote, registering to vote, especially amongst the youth, because there's a lot of excitement to vote for Vice President Harris on that front, with the arguments being that women's reproductive freedoms and the freedom of our children's are on the line, versus older generations wanting to go back to the America that they were taught to believe in. And therefore, again, the Make America Great Again notion has sprouted out
Is
from.
educational background also shaping electoral preferences in this election? Like some pundits are saying that high school graduates are more geared towards voting Trump, while college graduates are more geared towards voting Kamala. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. And there are studies on that about how the United States is higher education being defined as an undergraduate college degree education really shapes thinking. And so that's another reason why conservatives tend to shoot down and are advocating for the Department of Education's abolishment within the United States, especially the Trump campaign and with the Project 2025 experience, because they believe that higher education and that teaches critical thinking, and critical thinking being defined as thinking from neither the left or the right, but all from a holistic perspective, is making people quote unquote hate their own country. And this is coming in the form of critical race theory and ethnic studies that teaches the history of ethnic peoples within the United States. Because on the flip side, high school education curriculums are determined by states. And so I'm very lucky, for example, to be living in California, where our education curriculum enforces ethnic studies and teaches the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians within our own state. But each state's education curriculum differs. So for example, me learning about the history of, let's say, Japanese internment or Filipino-American farm laborers won't be the same education that someone in Florida, Texas, or Ohio would be getting. And so therefore, because high school education is not standardized, therefore lots of folks then tend to not have those critical thinking skills across the board. And I'm not saying critical thinking skills to say that people are dumb or they're not getting that level of education that would remark you as being a better voter than someone else, but more so the access to information and the suppression of information is the root problem that I'm really advocating against. And so, going back to the initial question of how do high school versus college level attainment really affect voters, what we see are the urban cores. That a lot of people who tend to have college degrees flock towards urban cores, and that's where we get the term college towns, for example. So when we see San Francisco being a very liberal haven city, a lot of folks there have college degrees. Whereas we go over to, let's say, Columbus or Cleveland, Ohio, where a lot of folks more so have high school degrees, and therefore why it tends to be more conservative than others. And so, all in all, your education level does tend to positively correlate, and my correlation, not being causation, but correlate towards your political preference.
Okay. Maraming salamat sa iyo, Filipino Young Professional Secretary Gabriel Young. Well,
Thank you,
Gabriel,
Gabe.
ingat sa iyo, ingat sa inyo lahat. At, well, we
Thank you, Gabe.
wish you the best.
Thank you. Daghang
Thank you.
salamat kayo. Have a great one. Bye.